Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to that video training about the Identity Manager. We are talking about the differences between 8.x and 9.x. This training is suitable just for people who understand the previous version and only need updates. For any beginner trainings, please look at the standard trainings available, where you can find the information about differences between one and the other version. Honestly, this is always documented in a file that is called the release notes, and release notes are something you can find to each version in the documentation of the Identity Manager. If we switch to the website of OneIdentity, you will see here support.oneidentity.com. Then you get that overview page, and on this overview page you can easily see there is the Identity Manager as a product. Clicking on Identity Manager, automatically the Identity Manager site opens, and what's necessary to get the release notes is the technical documentation here on the left. I click Technical Documentation. And with the technical documentation, I got here a product selector, and that product selection allows me to get any product that is just current available here on that page. The last one is always per default selected. This is 9.1. And if I need the release notes of 9.1, then I can directly click on release notes and find the document where in many pages all features, bug fixes, and something other else is just described. This is something you should have a look at if you want to get more technical details. But now let's continue us with this video. In the first section of that training, I will talk about the new feature which is called the LTS release of the Identity Manager. The first thing we need to talk about what exactly it's an LTS from an Identity Manager perspective. And from an Identity Manager perspective, you can see the timeline of releases. We are starting here on that very specific slide with the release of 8.2, and you see a planned 10.0 release at the end of that timeline. What an LTS now is, it's a major version of the Identity Manager. That means it is a version for long-time support. That is what LTS says. And what you as easily can see here is it starts with the first LTS, which is 9.0. And it continues with the next LTS, which is the version 10.0 here on that specific slide. The idea of LTSs, as always, is that LTSs keep a little bit longer and get only bug fixes, but no new features. That means all features implemented in the feature releases 9.1, 9.2 are not included into that LTS release. Only bug fixes, which are fixes to the status of 9.0, will happen. Therefore, the complete release is for 3 years available, and that is the important part of the story. As always, these things does have pros and cons. And of course, pros are for 3 years you have no problems with new features and maybe new bugs getting implemented in the Identity Manager. This means the complete release is for 3 years a little bit more stable, and the only thing that gets included are so named update packages. That means just bug fixes to the product. Why people are doing something like that? For example, they go with the LTS release because they want to reduce their implementation costs, and they want to reuse the training that might be necessary on the user side just to ensure people understand the new release. On the con side, of course, exists that you won't get features. That means for 3 years the Identity Manager is stable and all the new features implemented in the Identity Manager will not happen. The idea, of course, of the LTS is that there is more consistency in the releases in the future. Because of that, and that is what you can see here, all so named major releases, that means the move from a 8.0 to a 9.0 version or from a 9.0 to a 10.0 version, these are our main and major releases, and in the future we will name them LTS releases. All stuff in between, that means releases 9.1, 9.2, 9.3 or something like that, are minor releases, and these minor releases will be known as feature releases in the future. It is now up to you to select which type of channel you want to follow. That means the major release channel or the LTS channel, which is then from 9 to 10 and from 10 to 11, or you follow the minor release channel, which is the feature release channel, which means you get every new version of the Identity Manager. From a patch perspective, it is quite easy to understand. First of all, LTSs only gets service packs. And of course, if there is a new LTS available shortly after, all of these service packs / CUs will not be available for the previous LTS release. That means if you follow the LTS release path, then you will get a final patch release with the release of the next LTS, of course. And 1 year after the next LTS version was released, the old will expire. If you follow the feature release path, then you will get a final patch for the previous version 18 months after the current version was released. And if you insert that specific package, that version will at the end go out of support 6 months after that last package was inserted. And of course, it is to talk how to move between these releases. If you are on an LTS release path, it is possible at any time to jump to the next feature release. This means you will then follow the feature release path. In that very specific case, it is not that easy to jump to the LTS release because you have to wait until the last feature release that will then lead into the next major release. That means then the next big LTS version. Knowing that, it is quite easy to move between the release path, but it is harder to go from a feature release to an LTS release because you have to wait until the next LTS release exists, than just to jump from an LTS release to a feature release. Before we now follow the agenda, it might make sense to say some words about LTS or feature releases. There might be different scenarios customers or partners like to follow, and my suggestion is to follow a feature release at any time. The reason for that is, of course, that if you are, for example, on a cloud path, that means you are using Identity Manager on demand, it is very helpful and needful to get all the new features, especially because the integration costs are just taken by one identity and are part of your license price of the on-demand system. LTSs at all might make sense if you have a local installation and you are from a development perspective more stable. That means people are just working with what exists and the extension of your system happens just slowly. That means it is not that hard to wait 3 years before you can get some new Identity Manager features. In enterprises, where new features are always adopted and of interest, it is hard to follow the LTS path even if you have not an on-demand release. Knowing all of that, again, my suggestion is to follow the feature release path, but of course you know now the pros and cons and can make your own decision. In a very next step, we will just talk about all the prerequisites exists if you want to install a 9.x version. First of all, the database server, which is the main important prerequisite. It is possible to install 9.x on a 2019 server upper. Any 2017 versions are no longer supported. Whatever you install, you need the local installation of a SQL Server 2019, or you need an Azure SQL managed instance or an Azure SQL database. However, database level 150 is the level to choose. Of course, from a .NET Framework perspective, it is as well necessary to have the framework 4.8. If you use Azure SQL, then of course you need an Azure SQL database. This is what is supported, and this database needs to be created in Azure so that the installer can directly start to insert the schema. Indifferent to the local version, where just databases can get created, this is not possible for Azure. Therefore, the Azure database needs to exist. From a deprecated feature perspective, that means what is not longer in the product, we should talk about the DBQ processor agent. You know, there was the SQL Server agent in the past, and that SQL Server agent was just driving all the calculation jobs in the database. These calculation jobs exist, of course, again, but this time it is necessary to store them with the help of an agent service, which is now mandatory. That agent service was in the last version of 8.x, of course, optional, but with the new version, it is now mandatory. Reason for that is, of course, the cloud support, because Azure is not really good in working with SQL Server agent jobs, and so it's better to use a specific service. For you, that is not a big deal. You have only to install that specific agent and everything works fine. Support from installing two-factor authentication was in the past available. You know, we moved away from installing two-factor. If you now need something like that, Approval Anywhere will be your friend. That means you install the Stalling Cloud Assistant instead. Step-up authentication exists as well, and therefore you use now one login, which is part of one identity right now. Identity Manager SPML service and Identity Manager SOAP service, two web services we had in the past, are disappeared now. You can't use them anymore. Therefore exists, of course, the Identity Manager Application Server, which is a wonderful REST service. And for all the people who know web development a little bit better, there's a second one, which is called the API Server, which is a REST service as well. We don't support Exchange 2010 any longer and SharePoint 2010. That means if you have such installations, the connectors will not be able to work with these things anymore. And the old generic LDAP connector is as well gone away. Therefore exists just a new LDAP connector, which is version 2. But honestly, from a connector perspective, it is only a little bit configuration to switch from one to the other. Another deprecated feature removed from the Identity Manager is, of course, the API Designer. The API Designer was just a tool to configure the new API REST service. We are using now other tools to that, more standardized tools, and because of that, the API Designer was removed with this version. Visual Studio Code extension for HTML application development is as well disappear. I'm very sure that not a lot of people was using that, therefore in the meantime exists as well another option. And what is going away as well, it's the compiling of HTML applications with the help of the database compiler. This is now done internally in another way, so that is not necessary to use that anymore. Directly in connection to that, the administration of different versions of compiled projects using the compilation branches was as well removed. Another feature a lot of people was not really aware of, so it will not really be missed. And now let's talk about integration. On the integration side of the Identity Manager, you can easily see we are talking about the one login module. The one login module was built in the Identity Manager to integrate one login as a product. And we did that with the plan just to handle one login like each system, that means with the full governance support. Therefore, it is possible with the one login module in the Identity Manager to create and edit user accounts in one login. Additionally to that, it is possible just to assign entitlements like always, so accessing applications or authentication and authorization could be managed with the help of the Identity Manager. It will not be the Identity Manager module without the full-blown governance. Therefore exists, of course, things like attestation, identity audit, that means the integration in the rule engine, and user account management, IT shop, and reporting capabilities. Therefore, it is necessary to build as well a data structure from one login data, which happens like for each other connected systems in the Identity Manager world. If you look into the connector a little bit more detailed, then we have to say we are just using the API version 2 of one login. And that is as good as possible. That means due the restrictions that exists in that API. On the right hand side of the slide, you can see that small graph that shows exactly which type of objects can get supported in which depth. That means everywhere where a yes exists, it is possible, for example, to read or to add or to delete a record. And everywhere where a no exists, it is not possible from an API perspective. This means not that the future will not change things, because typically we are improving connectors and getting systems better integrated, but in version 9.x currently it looks like the right side shows. We support as well custom user properties, which is important for people with customized systems. And we already talked about that the OneLogin data is synchronized to the identity manager. If you look a little bit at the features, you can see in the manager of the identity manager, it looks like any other object. Displayed there is, of course, the OneLogin system with all the related objects. If we look a little bit more into the depth, then we see that a OneLogin domain does have its own overview sheet. We have as well main pages for all the objects, where all black could be edited and all gray could not be edited. We have as well a task list with a lot of rich features around the OneLogin system. And that should be enough here. Just connect your OneLogin system to the identity manager and figure out on your own what exists in addition. And now let's talk about some of the security enhancements of the identity manager. Happens with version 9.x. First, let's talk about more restrictive SQL security checks. Of course, there are new rules every day, what should be possible and what not. We are talking about the use of SQL in where clauses and to allow people just to manage or unlikely just configure the system using where clauses. It is now possible just to prevent use operations like, not like, or greater, greater than, greater, equal, and something like that. Just if you want to make your SQL system and the use of SQL more restricted than before. All of these operators was in the meantime known as sometimes problematic, and now it's possible to prevent them. Important to know is that if you do so, there are features and functions which of course will not work anymore. For example, things like the dynamic test of roles or something like that are not possible anymore if you just secure your system that way. To jump on that or not, you can use a specific new feature, which is called common allow risk where clauses, and this program function could be assigned or not assigned to specific people. If we look a little bit more into detail to that specific features, you see the new program function, and together with the program function exists, of course, new dialog groups. This is QER for critical where clauses. That is the dialog group you use then in role-based access. And there is QBM critical where clause, which is then the dialog group you will use for system users. And of course, together with the role-based access exists a new AE role, which allows at the end to manage all of that, and that is called base roles safety critical conditions. Again, that means if people don't have this specific permission not assigned, they are not able in the identity manager world to use all of these like operations anymore. As you can see here, for the API server and the web server exists some more security as well. The idea here is to prohibit SQL injection as good as possible, and therefore now it's necessary to use, together with the API server or the web designer, the configuration as a trusted application. This is during the installation, that means the upgrade something automatically set, but for all who wants to double check or wants to configure their system on their own, there are some places where you can have a look at. First of all, it is part of the application settings, and that means on the IAS host, there is a trusted source key necessary in the connection string. And other needs, of course, the trusted source key somewhere in the exe.config settings of the tool or in the config file of the specific application like designer. At the end, it is something that happens automatically, but you can double check the different positions. Our Skim connector version 2 that means the plugin for that specific thing, was upgraded in security as well. And here, as you easily can see, the functionality relational comparison operators was something that was assigned to a program function like we discussed it before. And that program function, it's known as API server SCIM, and is assigned to the dialog groups QER for AP server SCIM or QBM AP server SCIM, and for the role-based access assigned to a new application role, which is named API server SCIM filter. We do have password policies, as everybody knows, and these password policies in the past have had a specific set of requirements or configuration options could be configured. That was leading to the one or the other problem, and so it's now possible since 9.x just to define more properties if you like to. Therefore, an additional password requirements property was built. You can see it on the screen on the right side in the middle of the form. There is now a new field which is called additional requirements. In that very specific field, you can enter your specific requirements, which are customer specific and are requirements that don't exist somewhere other else in that specific policy. Of course, it makes no sense just to insert stuff that is already available, so please look at the other tabs first. If you don't find your specific requirement, you can add an additional one in that specific field. Additionally to that exists the capability to support password lengths up to 256. That might be for some robots or machines of interest, because I'm very sure nobody will insert a password which will show lengths like that. A new feature as well is the capability to block system users from the login to tools. Why that is necessary? Especially because in the past it was possible just to say, let's block the authentication module and nobody can sign in. In these cases, we was able to run in trouble. I'm not very sure if it was possible to block that specific basic authentication module at all. The reason for is we have some system users used in backup operations or in specific machine-driven operations like a service account. And to handle that, and on the other hand side as well to block the login as a system user, this new property exists. You can see it there. Dialog user is disabled for direct login, means a service is able to use that system user to log in, but any other person who tried to log in using a login mask will fail. And additionally to that specific behavior, we have added a new authentication module known as user account manual input role-based, which means it is possible to sign in with each system account, which is at the end specified in a way domain/user, and to get access role-based later on. This opens up the ability just to use whatever else system account to log into the identity manager role-based. The job service was getting a new feature as well. You know, in the past there was a specific authentication module called session HTTP authentication, and that authentication module was prohibiting users just to get access to the status page of the identity manager if they are not authenticated. Therefore, in the past, you was able just to assign a specific Active Directory group or another feature to users, and they was then getting access. The new feature now is that it is, like for all the other tools, possible to use the complete power of a one identity login page. You see that here on the left hand side, people can now use system users or role-based access or whatever to log in to such a service page if necessary. Once you passed it, you will get access to the status page of the job service. And of course, if this module is not configured, you will get access immediately. Job queue info got an update as well from a security perspective. Here the handling of frozen jobs was just assigned to a new program function. That means there is a new function job queue frozen, and only if people getting this specific function assigned using system users or using role-based access, they will have the capability to handle frozen jobs.